welcome to the research edition of Coping on the Coast, capturing the story of what happened, how we're coping, and what's next. The aim of these discussions will be to share and document experiences, innovative solutions, and lessons learned among coastal stakeholders enduring the pandemic, this historic moment in time. In sharing these stories and insights, we hope to provide inspiration to coastal peers, helping them address adversity moving forward. My name is Circe Gonzalez, and I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at Chesapeake Bay National Estuary and Research Reserve, Virginia. The Coastal Training Program is dedicated to working with professionals like the scientists on today's call to foster science-based and community-supported resource management and socio-ecological system resilience, which we accomplish through stakeholder engagement, facilitated collaboration, and opportunities like this. For those of you unfamiliar with Chesapeake Bay near Virginia, we are part of a system of 29 estuarine sites around the country, born out of the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. Each represents a partnership between NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and a state. Our immediate state partner is the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, fondly known as VIMS. As a National Estuarian Research Reserve, we have a mandate to conduct research and stewardship, to empower the community through education, and to empower coastal decision makers through training and advisory service. Today's discussion will spotlight Virginian researchers who have been working hard to maintain safe practices in their studies and monitoring efforts, much of which informs management. Moderating today's discussion will be Chesapeake Bay near Virginia's director, William Ray. Welcome, Willie. Thanks for joining the conversation.
Hey, Circe.
Willie is the director of Chesapeake Bay near Virginia. And in addition to serving as director, Willie is a research associate professor in the Department of Physical Sciences at VIMS. Willie's current efforts focus on enhancing research and coastal resilience through the development and implementation of estuarine and coastal water quality monitoring programs and their integration into coastal observation systems, water quality assessments, and water-based industry operations. All right, Willie, we're gonna hand it over to you for some opening remarks and to get us started on questions.
Okay, sounds good. So there's no question that we've all become a little familiar with uncertainty. It's lingering everywhere. The questions is, how do you plan for the future when you really don't know what the future is holding right now? We're sort of operating in a very dynamic environment. So as scientists, we typically look for science-based information and we move forward from there. We plan on science and we make our decisions based on science. And so from every aspect, that's how we've been trained and that's how we move forward. So it does provide the context for planning and management, and it alerts us for adapting. That allows us to adapt to a changing environment. But what happens when the science itself is compromised? So today, we're fortunate to be having a conversation with researchers from around the Bay on the impacts of the pandemic on their work and ways they've mitigated the pandemic restrictions and how they're planning for essentially a bit of uncertainty down the road. We're not sure from our end. It's changing weekly. We all see the maps on television, and one day you're green, one day you're red. And the governor's office and our state and federal agencies are responding. And so it's very dynamic, and we're down the food chain a little bit. And then we have to take all these matters into consideration as we try to maintain our programs for the benefit of society. So we've got a great panel with us today representing researchers from a variety of agencies. We're going to have folks introduce themselves, and then we're going to answer one of the first big questions. And that question is, how have you and your organization been impacted by the COVID pandemic?
My name is Dave Alberg, and I'm the superintendent for the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary. The Monitor National Marine Sanctuary was the first national marine sanctuary established in the country in 1975 and is managed by NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries under the Department of Commerce. The sanctuary is actually located off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, but our offices are in Newport News, Virginia, on the grounds of the Mariners Museum. Like everybody else, we're no exception. It's been a bit of a crazy few months. For me, I would say what has been most interesting is how it has evolved from its beginnings, which was, well, we're going to shut down for a couple of weeks, but we'll be back by April 1st and see how things go, and then the realization that this was maybe going to be a couple months to now, where it may be. I think most of us feel like there won't probably be a return to normal till sometime middle of next year. And by normal, I mean everybody back in the office as if COVID hadn't been a thing. And in fact, in many ways, things may be changed forever in terms of how we do business and how we conduct our operations. So we continue to do, much of the education outreach work that we've done before, but now it's all online. And I would say that there's been a bit of a lag in terms of spinning up and becoming familiar with that technology across our staff. And then there's certainly been some things that have been put on hold, research, big projects that we had planned for August that have now been slid to next year. These were significant projects, hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been moved. But our approach has been to take this time, polish it even more, and make sure that the partners we'll be working with and our team produce the best science that we can next year when the time is right. So a mixed bag. We're trying to stay positive, but it's definitely been strange. And I would just close with saying that it's not fixed. It's a very fluid situation, as was mentioned a moment ago. One day we're green, one day we're red, and trying to adapt to that has been interesting.
I'm Mark Bennett. I'm the Science Center Director for the USGS Virginia and West Virginia Water Science Center. I'm located in Richmond, and we do applied science across both Virginia and West Virginia, usually in cooperation with other federal agencies or state and local governments as well, providing them science and data that they utilize for decision-making purposes. And from how have we been impacted by COVID? We went to a maximum telework situation almost immediately. And I think one of the main concerns that we had was how do we still collect our data? How do we still get out? So what kind of adjustments do we have to make? A lot of times we have multiple people riding to sites together in vehicles. Some of our protocols require that more than one person be involved in certain types of data collection. So how do we adjust? How do we adjust on the fly? We didn't want people riding together in vehicles. We wanted to modify some of our protocols with regard to data collection, but only to the extent that we needed to make sure that it didn't affect that data collection, because it's very important that when we collect data that it's consistent through time. So we have to be very careful with that regard. I would say by and large, we haven't really had to hold anything up or postpone anything. Our data collection for the most part has been happening as scheduled. And I think most of our projects are moving along scheduled as well. It has provided communication issues. I think that's the same for everybody. How do we continue to communicate with each other in terms of collaborative science with our partners, et cetera. But I think people are making the best of it given the situation, and I would say that I'm pleasantly surprised in terms of the overall response.
Cora Johnston. I'm the site director at the University of Virginia's Coastal Research Center, which is located in Oyster, Virginia. And as part of that, coordinating that institution, I also help coordinate the research for the Virginia Coast Reserve Long-Term Ecological Research Program, or the LTER. So we are a university institution, so we're a branch of the University of Virginia that's located out on the coast. But the vast majority of our research is funded through a long-term grant from the National Science Foundation. That has provided us with some stability because it's a long-term grant cycle. We've been able to push some of our programs back. We've been able to extend some of our deadlines. But it also means that our focus is on long-term data collection. So during COVID, and while thinking about sort of setting our priorities, we were also pushed almost immediately to telework. So we essentially were put in full shutdown, everyone go home, stop all programs. And then that gave us some time to set some priorities. And then the university was very good about giving us ramp up guidance with a lot of advance notice. And our priority was to focus on our long-term data sets. We have data sets that we've been collecting, say, quarterly since the 1980s. And so trying to keep continuity of long-term data was also key for us. The main impact that we've had has been reduced personnel on site. So our 5-person research staff at our particular institution all lives locally, and we've been able to work from home except for when we need to go into do field research. But the graduate students, the undergraduate students, the PIs that come in from Charlottesville and other areas of the state to do research with us, that's what was immediately put on hold. We still haven't been allowed to bring undergraduates back. And so what we've been doing is we had to shift a lot of the research from a PI and student-based support to staff-based support. So we have, instead of 28 people living full-time on site, we can have a maximum of 4 at any given time. And so that means that we've managed to conduct a lot of our long-term research. And so not much has fallen by the wayside. We've been pretty successful, but staff have been incredibly busy. Given that there's been only 4 people visiting at a time instead of 28, it has still felt like a full season to us because we are trying to pick up in all the places that are needed in order to support the critical research. The one other big impact has been on our education and outreach programs and connection to the community. That's the first thing that was shut down, and that's been the slowest thing to return, in part because virtual learning and connectivity has been so low in our really rural community. And so we're having to figure out with a lot of other really rural institutions, how do we connect to students that aren't even being reached well by their schools? That's our next challenge.
I'm Emily Trena-Costa. I'm an environmental scientist with EPA's Chesapeake Bay Program Office in Annapolis, Maryland. And the Chesapeake Bay Program Office helps support the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, which is a partnership between all of the states in the watershed and Washington, D.C., several federal agencies, local partners, and nonprofits. And as part of that, I coordinate the Chesapeake Bay Program's scientific technical assessment and reporting team. So in terms of impact from COVID, I think one of the main functions that we serve at the Chesapeake Bay Program is to provide scientific and technical information and data to our state and local partners that can help guide their restoration and conservation efforts. And so that's a big role that we play. I think one thing has become very apparent during COVID is that our state and local partners have a lot of other things they have to worry about too. And so, especially at the local level, oftentimes the people that are involved in watershed planning or involved in restoration or conservation efforts also wear 10 other different hats. And so they have been pulled away to some of those very pressing issues that have come up during COVID. And so that's one of the things we've noticed is a bit of a, in some circumstances, having to adjust that engagement with them or having to potentially put some things aside while they work on those pressing issues. Same with our state partners, sometimes within the agencies, the folks that are involved in water quality or watershed planning have even been pulled to other COVID-related priorities. So that's something that we've noticed is an impact because it's such a big role of ours to help engage our partners over that science and technical information that they just have a lot of other things, especially in circumstances like this, that they have to deal with. The other thing I'll add is in terms of monitoring, Mark gave a great overview of some of the adjustments on the monitoring side. The Chesapeake Bay Program Office also supports monitoring in the tidal waters of the Chesapeake Bay in conjunction with the state agencies from Maryland and Virginia, as well as supporting a very mature and robust citizen science monitoring body and network. And so there have been adjustments in both of those that have had to happen as well, whether it's during the stay-at-home orders or to ensure social distancing is going on. And so I think one of the things that that we're still looking to see is, are we going to have gaps? And if we do have gaps in monitoring, how do we address those and make sure that, as Mark said, we're continuing that long-term collection as necessary?
I think we're all playing from the same playbook a little bit. I think we're quietly getting our job done. And so I think the one thing I want to bring up is I feel like our institute, I'm sure it's across the board, we were sort of well organized. We had a good structure already in place before the pandemic hit in terms of operations, safety, all these things. So I think that really helped us. We weren't starting from ground level zero. And so what our institute did, and I just want to throw out there, we were talking about the dynamic nature of this is, so essentially we're a state agency with the college and with them. So, we have the governor's office, and then we would have to respond to William and Mary, and then my lab would have to respond to VIMS. And so we, as you go down the road a little bit, you have all these protocols being developed, interpretations going on. So it's sort of hats off that we're seeing these programs really delivering at a high level. Just to throw out, we had on March 12th, Executive Order 51, on April 1st, Executive Order 53, 55, 65, 67, 68. Each one of those put every organization into a whole new planning mode. And so I just want to recognize that. So what we did at our institute here is we set up specific to COVID was an emergency task team. That was our high-end administrators, our dean, our associate deans, and then our facilities operations. And then what we went from there is we defined critical research, since this panel is focused on that. There was a fair amount of discussion, and that discussion didn't operate in a vacuum, but critical research was defined because you simply could not have investigators just saying, oh, mine's critical. There were things, and I think Mark brought up a lot of these things, these long-term continuous data sets, there's a high value. Are they being used for advisory service, for water quality assessments by key partners? So these were all things. Are there samples that could not be preserved? There are handling times on samples. There are equipment that must be maintained. There are research animals, cultures. So these are all the thought process that went into this, not just field operations. So a lot of laboratory. So we were looking at our labs, our field operations, and our vessels when we were rolling these things out. So we had to define that, and they were not project specific, they were criteria. And then we would submit plans to our administration and move forward from there. Those plans had to address everything we're talking about, with safety and those types of things. I will say at the beginning of those plans where we left it up to every individual, it was up to them where their level of comfort was. If someone, every individual had issues, whether a health that put them in a high risk, taking care of aged, parents, taking care of children, this all came into play a little bit, and that's part of that flexibility. So we moved forward on our plans. We were fortunate enough, we had a large number of kind of critical research that we moved forward on. We are operating under a skeleton crew, but it's going well. I do want to put up one thing. I'm so glad for technology because I was able to get a lot of data by just visiting one site maybe every 10 days. So just so folks know, there's a lot of information that can be collected and maintained by periodic visits. So I think technology helped play a part of this for us to deliver what we need to be doing. So I think that's sort of it. We're constantly changing. We're moving from critical research now to getting back to more other studies that could be going on, getting a little bit more into graduate research. And so now we're opening the door a little bit, but now we're also seeing, we can be pulled back at the same time. One of the questions we wanted to start off about was, where has flexibility been needed to keep your institution afloat? And I think we were looking at Cora to start that conversation.
For us, I think the biggest flexibility there has been who gets research done and how we do it. So we've been very focused on identify what the key research is and make it happen, even if that may look a little different than it used to. So we have been doing a lot of modifications in terms of exchanging protocols and getting new people trained on doing certain protocols just because they're available, accessible, they don't need dorm space. We've worked a lot on becoming more autonomous. So we spent a good bit of our early summer figuring out things like sampling systems where people would not need to hand each other equipment or hand each other samples. So, you know, as you mentioned before, Willie, technology has really been a savior because of, you know, putting out data loggers and things that could collect data for us while we're not there. But then probably the second most valuable thing that we have on hand now is a bunch of inflatable inner tubes with bottoms, like snow sleds, because now we have one for every researcher to tie to their weight belt and tow it along with them, and they have everything they need, every data sheet. And so it's like the lowest tech things, you know, that and like a handful of clipboards, and those have been instrumental in keeping people separated, because one of our first rules we put in place was that we would not conduct any research that couldn't be done while maintaining distance. Because one of the things we learned early is that masks are impossible to wear when they're wet. They're completely suffocating. And so there was just immediately a trade-off where if we're doing water work, we can't wear masks. And if we can't wear masks, we absolutely cannot be close to each other. So the mixture between technology and low-tech solutions has been key. And then really just staff has been incredible in stepping up and being willing to do things they haven't done before in terms of the primary data collection as opposed to just research support. And so I think that's been one of our biggest things. And I have really noticed in doing this that everyone has been incredibly graceful, because we've asked everyone to be incredibly flexible and accommodating while we were trying to figure out how to fit all of the key research into a summer with significantly reduced capacity. And that everybody that we have worked with has been incredibly adaptable and understanding. And that is something that has really helped us be successful and that we're looking forward to maintaining moving forward.
I think the main area where we really had to look at flexibility was with our staff. Because we do a lot of field work and we have people that are high risk or are living with people that are high risk or taking care of people that are high risk, had kids at home, and we really didn't want those people going out in the field. That meant that there were other people that were having to go out in the field more. And so we ended up with some people who what we call it working the record. So they're checking the data and doing that part of it. And then other people now that are going out more frequently and collecting data. So that means instead of doing both, they're out on the road quite a bit with day trips, because initially we weren't doing overnights either. So that it really put people on the road with longer days. And people have been really good about you know, balancing the work in terms of the folks that are going out all the time now, and the folks that really kind of need to stay home and take care of their family or take care of themselves.
I'm struggling with a little bit of like equitable treatment of staff. We have very broad job position responsibilities and descriptions. And some can very easily, you know, fall into the telecommute model, those things. And then I have some that are just full on field operations. And, you know, I've always struggled. And I think, you know, I have to back off that personally a little bit, because I'm like, I want to be equitable to everybody, professional training for everybody, days or whatever. And the epidemic has sort of taken some of that aside, and, you know, it's more like, okay, we're a team, and let's just all get together so everybody can do their job. We're all dependent on each other for certain products, and we move forward. So I think I have to back off and, you know, get into the, you know, accept the flexibility, the variability of the job descriptions a little bit more, those types of things. Because as this goes on, folks get fatigued. I work with folks on a daily basis, and then others I work with on a Zoom meeting. And I think after a while, it's just, you miss those people, and it's like, oh, I'm bumping to this person, not in the hall, we keep our 6-foot distance, but I constantly see this person, and there's inner exchanges that are occurring. And then we do have a lot of communication during the week, but nothing, I don't think, near what we had in the office setting. So I think those are things we just have to guard against and keep the energy high and recognize there is variability among all the staff, and we're fortunate to maybe have some flexibility, because there are other positions out there in the business world that don't have that luxury. So that's just something I need to work on, I think, a little bit.
The staff equity has also been huge, because our staff vary so much in what they do. And I agree that that has been a real challenge. And it's also been good to learn to sort of let go of that a little bit and just take up that teamwork mentality of everyone step up and do what you can safely do, and we will get this done. And we're just going to manage with what we're doing. And for the most part, we've had a really lean in mentality, and everyone, because there's been a concern about not pulling your weight based on what you're able to do or not do, for the most part, that's worked out nicely. And so it's been helpful to be able to shift mindsets to that.
Our long-term monitoring is very different than some of the other sites within the sanctuary program, but places like the Florida Keys, Grays Reef, Stellwagen Bank, that have long-term, multi-year monitoring programs going on, this was quite a hit. And it also was interesting early on in the pandemic, looking at March, April, sort of the evolution of the thinking. Initially, a lot of the thinking was, well, if you're out on a boat, it's fresh air, you're moving at 15 knots. You couldn't come up with a safer environment to be working out on in terms of COVID. And I think as the understanding of the transmission of the virus, and how even today we're looking at it, I think we're taking a very different approach. So it also falls into the question about what is mission critical research that Willie talked about earlier, that, what has absolutely got to happen and what doesn't have to happen. Are you going to lose 10, 15 years worth of data if you don't go out and maintain this continuum of research, or are there things that can take a pause? And each of the different sites has had to grapple with that. For the monitor, our projects are pretty much compartmentalized. So if it shifts, it'll impact dollars, it may impact partners, but it doesn't impact that continuity of research. So we're in a slightly different place than many of the other members of the panel may be on. But like everything else, it's been fluid, it's been evolving, and I don't anticipate that changing. I think if you look forward the next 5 to 6 months, as more information comes out and new protocols are invented and implemented, we're going to see how we tackle research shifting again.
One of the things we've noticed that we have needed a bit of flexibility in, and may need to build more flexibility into in the future, is with our grants management. So we provide grants to the states for restoration and for monitoring. We provide grants to academic institutions and a whole slew of nonprofits to carry out science and research or restoration activities. And the due dates and the deliverables for those grants were all written in a pre-COVID world. And so with some of the constraints that have come due to COVID, that's something that we've needed to keep in mind is, are there things that we need to shift around in the grants to ensure that we're accommodating those constraints and still being successful? And then moving into the future, are there ways that we need to build some flexibility into those so that we can be prepared for other possible constraints that come up in the future?
Emily, I'm glad you brought that point up, because one of the decision factors, I think, when looking at critical research and helping us move forward, as far as a lot of our organizations have, is recognizing that the funding sources are sensitive to the deliverables. And that was extremely important with respect to the actual deliverable dates, those potential extensions. I think that is one piece, and I'm really glad you brought that up in the forefront. That was tremendous.
On the funding side of things, having an NSF grant that runs most of our research, and thinking forward to what do we need to do in order to maintain continuity of research, in part to ensure that we are funded again in the future and that we're delivering what we promised on the current grant. That was really key for us. And that's particularly important because so there's sort of two parallel entities at our institution. One is sort of the brick and mortar. It's our Coastal Research Center, which is a fee-based institution. And so charging fees for use of our boats and our dorms and our lab spaces is what runs our institution, and most of those are billed to these grants. And so trying to make sure that enough research was happening to keep these, to be able to report successfully back on these grants is really key to making sure that our station will have support moving forward. Because right now, we're bringing in very little money as a station. And so we're sort of having to play the long game in terms of how do we make sure that the research stays successful, because our station is only successful if the research continues.
What I saw happening to our education and training programs, I felt very fortunate to be on the research end of things, because I believe those programs were essentially cut off at the knees and had to adapt on the fly with social networking or moving to all virtual programs. Just like the research programs, they did not throw their hands up. It was like, we want to deliver our programs. But I think a lot of the flexibility and the adaptations occurred there. Ours was more, from our end on our research, just assuring safety and those types of things as we moved on. We did some things on the fly, like some folks have small sediment labs in their garages and things like that. But I would sort of say, I just want to, my hat's off to the education and the training programs, those that deal with the public. Those I believe had to adapt on the fly. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to our panel that might have some other ideas on, with their research programs, sort of quickly adapting those, making some changes on the fly.
So so first of all, the Chesapeake Bay program, we're very fortunate that because we're a partnership program spread all around the watershed, our partners are in all different places, and a lot of what we do was virtual already. So we were very fortunate that in our day-to-day, a lot of our communication and work with our partners was kind of the same as what it's always been. But going off of what you were saying, one of the programs that we do have in the summer is a summer research internship program called C-Stream, and it's through the Chesapeake Research Consortium. And actually, if there are any students listening to this, you should totally go on and check it out. It's a really great program. But a lot of those internships and those projects over the summer are involved in some sort of field work or outdoor research, or the students are very one-on-one with their mentor. And so one of the things we had to do on the fly was we had already accepted a whole bunch of students for the summer program with specific projects that they were going to be working on. And we basically had to adjust all of those projects to be fully virtual. And I think it was I think, very successful, but I think it showed a very interesting side of research that maybe the students hadn't thought about going into it, which is about data consolidation, data analysis, all of the different things that you can do virtually in research that don't involve field work, or after you come back and you've processed your samples and now you need to do some of the actual analysis on them. So I think it was really successful the way that we adjusted it and showed, again, that kind of interesting other side of research that's after or before field work, and opened the students up to the things that you can do virtually.
One area where certainly we had to adapt, with regard to safety, working in labs, working on boats, a lot of those things. But one thing that we were able to do internally, because so much of our data is actually real time, we can see it coming in. And because of that, and because we had fewer people in the field, it allowed us to prioritize really where we needed to go, because we can see fouling and we can see when equipment's down. And so by having that real-time network and having all that data and being able to look at it, it allowed us to kind of make, we were trying to optimize, trying to make priority decisions to keep the network up and running.
For us, having to be adaptable came down to work environment for the most part. People in our office, telework is available, but nobody ever really did it. We all come into the office and we'd work, and it was very collaborative environment, and suddenly it's not. And two takeaways was that, one, many of our jobs, I think we discovered, could be done from telework, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to do. The products could be produced. We can hold a video teleconference from home just as easily as we could from the office. We can work on a Word document just as easily from home, but that lack of human contact was and continues to be really a challenge, and that's a separate issue from dealing with the home environment, and if you've got kids or a spouse or a partner or all the other things that go on that can make that a challenge. So although, I guess in summary, the lesson was, wow, we can do a lot through telework, and wow, I hope we don't ever have to do a lot through telework ever again, because I'd much rather be in the office working with people and with the public and with our partners. So I'm not sure if I'm making a salient point here, but it's again, it's been very, very interesting and unexpected what's kind of come out of this.
I guess one of the things we did adapt on the fly, and you sort of took the lead on this, was internal communications. So I have not seen some folks for 6 months, and we knew that's a problem. So I think almost immediately we went to the value of meeting as a group, as a program. And so we had weekly Zoom calls coming in, and then we followed up with what are we calling it, the river of life, and our small presentations. We're getting to know each other better, getting to know our internal research better across the whole program. That was sort of instrumental, and I found at our institute that was, when you're in an academic setting, many times it's a lab is doing the work, and there might only be a few folks associated with the lab, and so potentially the department, yes, it will handle the faculty, but maybe not the entire staff. And we sort of found out that the centers and some of the agency-sponsored programs, all, the C grants, the NERRs, folks like that, were all kind of, this was part of their culture a little bit, was internal communications. And then we started seeing the department see the value, I think, so for that long-term health and for communicating. That's one thing I think I saw, was the way communication was dealt with. That changed sort of on the fly. And I think some of the agency folks could lead that a little bit. They've been doing that for a while. Let's say like the NSF program, it's a whole group of folks under a common roof, and I think that played off well. I also just want to bring up one thing. We were also able on the fly just to help out some of our key partners that might have typically worked on samples in larger vessels. Larger vessels were an entirely different story than small vessels. And so we were actually able to collect water samples for them, bring, on certain systems that we had our vessels out on, bring that in. So I think a lot of that conversation with your partners helped out. The idea was, how can we put a stopgap in measure that allows that program to really keep moving forward, even though they may not have been able to have that field capacity or whatever capacity at that moment. And now they have that, so they're back on track.
Operationally, we were positioned in June. Funding was locked in place for a new position at our office. That's there, it's available, but I've struggled a little bit with, is now the right time to hire a new person, even though I know ultimately their job, like the rest of ours, can be done remotely. But integrating a new person into the environment and the culture of the office, the history that we teach remotely, and hiring somebody that I may not see in person for 5, 6, 7 months, I'm struggling with that a little bit, and the result has been we haven't pulled the trigger on the hiring. So there's funding in place, there's a desk waiting, and there's a need, but I'm reluctant to make that change right now because of where we're at.
I think I'm hearing a little bit out there, but are there things that we might actually change in our operations due to the COVID pandemic that might actually increase efficiency or the value of the product?
Yeah, so I think one of these things I already mentioned, and that's with our grants and grants management, and just looking to see if there are opportunities to whether it be add some flexibility or look at the way that those are written going forwards to at least be better prepared for situations that might bring up constraints like COVID did. So I think that that's one thing that we're definitely looking at potentially trying to improve in the future. I will say that one of the silver linings has been a chance to do some better strategic planning. I think we're often all running at dead speed ahead so often that we don't really have time to take a step back and do some strategic planning on things. And so that's something that we are trying to take advantage of, is the time to be to do some of that planning. Can we be more strategic about the way that we engage our state and local partners and provide technical outreach, those sorts of things? And so are there ways that we can be more strategic about our science and research needs as a program and connecting with providers on those needs? I think those are some of the kind of strategic planning, a chance to actually get to do, which we normally don't have a chance to do. And so I think that's going to help improve our process going forward as well.
I mentioned some of the changes, that we're looking at with regard to data collection, but something that interesting that came up involves training. We have 4 offices across our center, 2 in West Virginia, 2 in Virginia, and a group of our scientists started what they call Coffee and Learn. So once a week in the morning, they do a training session, and it could be, training on data collection, working record, a variety of different things. And different people have been taking the lead on each of these things. And it's really nice to have people from the different offices, because pretty much everybody from all the offices, is getting on the calls. And it's nice to see the interaction between people that maybe wouldn't normally interact because we are a state away from each other. So that's actually been a real positive, and I think something that we'll continue, we will continue to do.
Following up on Mark, is it allowed us a little time. We've wanted to get there, but we've had a little extra time with some of our folks that are doing a little more telecommuting, was developing kind of our automated QA/QC of our data. So I think that'll be a great gift to our lab folks and to our data managers, who are all wearing glasses and looking at spreadsheets currently. And then the other thing I think that will continue on is the value that we put on career development for young people. The young folks, everything just evaporated on them. Fellowship programs, REU programs, summer jobs. So while yes, we had, we're not open to the public, we tried to maintain some of these virtual. We were hoping if things, when we started these in spring, that if things look better in the summer, we could invite some folks down to kind of complete their field studies or give them a better sense of that project. That did not turn out per se, but we worked with a number. We kept all of our fellows, our interns intact. They did have good experiences. And one of the ways that we did this was they all became volunteers of the Institute. And as a volunteer, they go through our safety training and through check-ins, and they were treated as staff. And that allowed us to invite them in virtually. And then in some cases, they're able to help out in the field, but that's very marginal. But they are able to work on projects, and they didn't lose a summer.
I think one of the big things for us has been developing a little bit more efficiency in some of our field sampling, because we were forced to work in smaller crews, being a little bit more creative about how we collect data and how we complete protocols. And some of that worked well enough that we're hoping, so we often work in small groups, but then we have a few major annual sampling events where we tend to have really large crews that go out and do work for multiple days. And we tried some new things this year because we were forced to, and some of them were really successful. So I think that is one place where we'll likely change some of the aspects that were forced on us by COVID. We also, I think there's been a certain amount several people have commented on sort of flexibility and staffing and who's completing what work. And I think that there has been sort of an uptick in adaptability and compassion across our team. A lot of people willing to step in and do things they didn't do before, and willing to sort of take other people's best interests in mind while also triaging what they're doing. And it has also done things like revealed to us, like many field stations, we are always really at capacity in the summer and staff are maxed out. You know, if anything, we're understaffed. But COVID brought in these huge uncertainties where, you know, if a staff member needs to quarantine for 2 weeks, we just have to do without them. And turns out it's not the end of the world. Turns out operations are just fine and we figure out a way forward. And, you know, many people were willing to come to the rescue in those situations. So that was a really good demonstration of thinking a little bit differently about how we staff projects and how we manage personnel time in the sort of heat of the season during research, and keeping that perspective moving forward, I think will be really valuable.
So David, we'll go to the next question. We'll tag you to start the conversation. So how has your organization response to COVID changed over time? Let's say from, I guess, March, you know, that first week to the following months. And I think, you know, we're sort of preparing for the end of the calendar year. And I think you were even thinking this may go further. So just sort of maybe looking at this over time, sort of how has your response changed?
Well, I would say that following those initial few weeks of uncertainty as to whether this was going to be a 1 week thing, 2 week thing, and then we're back. And once it became clear it was a longer term thing, our program directed each of the sites of the units within it to, in coordination with larger NOAA, to begin developing a reintegration strategy based on local health departments, local data from city, county, the state. And so we went from phase 0, which was mandatory telework, unless it was mission critical, everybody's at home, which took place during the months of April and May, with the goal of then going to a phase 1, which and then a phase 2, and then a phase 3, which was basically back to normal. And developing criteria for what that would look like. And so we as our office, we pulled that together and went into phase 1, which included the ability to bring, and we have a relatively small staff, but we could bring up to 25% of the original staff back into the facility. For us, with a staff of 7 people, and also, again, as I said earlier, looking at sort of this realization that much more work could be accomplished via telework. Wasn't coming back into the office just because you wanted to come back into the office was not an acceptable justification to do it. So of all of our people, it really was our IT personnel who also support multiple sites within the system. Of all the people on our staff, they were the ones that were probably most could receive the benefit of that. So in June, we began to set up that system to bring our IT guy in 1 day a week. He could work from the office, everyone else stays home. And I think we were under that phase 1, which is the first step to getting back to normal, for about a week and a half before things ramped up again with COVID numbers in the state, and we went back to 0, which is where we're at now. So we have a good plan in place to get us back into business, but I don't have any confidence that that's going to be happening relatively soon. I think, you know, and all of us, I'm no epidemiologist and or no expert on public health, but just reading the tea leaves, I think this is a long-term thing. We're also coming into the flu season. So my hunch is that we will begin to see a return back to normal driven by vaccines and their development and their rollout, which, depending on which expert you listen to, puts us still 9 months to a year out. My hope would be that within the next 6 to 9 months, we can get back to having the office available for 1 or 2 people at a time maximum. But I don't see it getting probably much better than that anytime soon.
At UVA, at the Coastal Research Center, one of the best things that we did was take a bit of time to develop our plan and include the phased responses in it, so that at this point, so far, we have not shifted phases. We shifted early on to phase 1, which allowed any researchers that were non-critical staff on site, but beyond that, we've remained frozen. but our plan already includes all the phases up through full return to complete operations. And so that has made it relatively easy because we don't have to figure out what that will look like on the fly. Right now we have a plan that incorporates all of it. And one of the key things in making those decisions was for field stations in particular, what became evident very quickly is that we were these strange orphans of universities, these large institutions that were making decisions based on main campuses and around sort of central functions. And almost every university has a field station or two, but they don't focus on them, and they don't necessarily, you know, the people making the decisions, the deans and the vice presidents, that's not at the center of their attention. And so they turned a lot to the field stations and said, okay, well, given the policies that we have written for the main campus, interpret these based on what you think is relevant for your institution. So we were really writing a lot of our own policies. So dealing with that, one of the absolutely critical resources was the Organization for Biological Field Stations, which luckily was already a really well coordinated network. And it was a lot of people in positions similar to mine who all got in touch with each other and said, our universities have no idea how to deal with us. Let's talk to each other. And so we were swapping plans back and forth in order to develop things like the boating policies and the fieldwork policies that just were not as relevant to the big plans the universities were making. And I think that helped a lot of us come up with more robust plans faster, so that we can have these sort of phased approaches that consider all these different scenarios that are likely to come into play before anything returns to full operations.
I think one area where we have had to constantly rethink how we would respond is disaster response. So, we're primarily a water center, so we think primarily in terms of floods. But when we have a flood, generally speaking, we're bringing people in from multiple states. And, with quarantines changing from state to state and not being allowed to travel to certain states from certain other states, how we would respond to an event like that is something we've constantly had to rethink. We also have volcano researchers and earthquake researchers. So, how do you get to Hawaii if they have a 14-day quarantine period and there is a volcano? So USGS at large has had to constantly rethink how we would respond to those types of events.
I think from my perspective, since we have been maintained a fairly operational lab, aside from our education and our training programs, which have actually been doing quite well with, moving in new directions. I do think some of, we're looking a little bit more, or I'm looking a little bit more longer term now, looking at the health of the organization in terms of finances. So that's a little bit of a shift. We went from the emergency mode, meeting our mission, trying to meet essential deliverables, now to looking to make sure that we come out the other side healthy, and that we can keep moving forward as an organization. So that's starting to crop in right now. We do know that our partners, our funding partners, everybody's impacted, and so I think we're looking at collaboration, flexibility, the same things we were talking about for research, but ways to maintain all of our operational shops and things like that. So I think some of the thoughts going into that, because that's sort of outside the personal health, staff health, now financial health is starting to crop into the decision making.
We just finished our first phase of FY21 budget planning for our offices, which starts October 1st. And that was tougher than I thought, because usually that's, I've got core operations and the expenses that we know of, and then we look at, what are our priorities for the coming year. But everything from anticipating what our travel needs will be to supplies, equipment, what those big priorities will be. If you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have said it was got to be pretty much the same drill as it has been for 15 years. But this time was not. I mean, and ultimately in our budget, our draft initial budget, we're looking at For instance, just take travel, for instance, being probably about 15% of what it had been in a normal year. And those funds that are then freed up by not anticipating travel, where do we reprogram those? Do we reduce the budget requests? Do we come up with other things? But it has had a larger impact than I would have anticipated or was expecting to have to account for when we developed the budget. So
that's something that has shifted for us is several people have mentioned the timeline of, we think this is going to be a couple weeks, no, this is going to be a couple months, no, this might be a couple years. Those thinking about the budget, it's very different. If we have to go through another entire summer with almost no visitors bringing in station fees, that's going to hurt a lot more than making it through one summer without that. And so that's something that we're also looking at is that sort of, how long do we have to weather this before we really become concerned about financial?
I think I'm going to blend two questions together because we've been having some of the discussions but overlapping, but the two questions are, the first is, has your program shifted priorities? And my initial thought is it might be a bit early for that. So the next thing is I want to kind of maybe do, is your organization asking new questions of your work? Or are there some areas that you might find of interest moving forward as a result of the pandemic?
I mean, I don't think we've shifted our priorities much because, again, we've been able to keep most of our science and data collection, almost all of our science and data collection going. Certainly there is probably some new research related to COVID where there's interest in terms of, can we detect it in wastewater and different water sources, things like that. So we're certainly seeing research, not just by USGS, but a number of federal agencies, along those lines.
Actually, along the same lines of some of the interesting research questions that may come up, I think one of the things we might be interested in is how has this whole year and what's been happening with shutdowns and quarantines and things like that with COVID, does that register an impact on water quality? There's a lot less cars on the road, things like that. And so are we going to see some sort of signal in our monitoring from just this whole year of society having changed so much than what would be considered normal?
LTER, the Long-Term Ecological Research National Network, is focusing on a similar thing, that each individual site is remaining focused on their long-term data sets and data continuity. But then at the network level, there are PIs who are starting to look through our collective data to see if there are signs of the anthropause, right, that are changes in activity. And so it has looked very different at the site level. It's just remained consistent, but at the network level, new questions are emerging.
We sort of initially had, one of our investigators had the water quality, thought, oh, this might be an interesting topic. And I thought, oh, there's so much variability in the system. But, maybe some of the atmospheric scientists might be able to pick it up a little easier. But, we just got 8 inches of rain, so it's a really tough one to tease these things out with the natural variability. But I think there are some areas, and maybe there's some really smart people out there that will know how to look at some of these questions. So great.
The research continuity, it's also been rewarding when everyone was talking about what is critical research and just maintaining our fundamental data sets. Here on the shore, one of the things that has come up is that we put in all this work to maintain our regular data sets, and sometimes you're like, this feels crazy. There's a global pandemic and we're putting out temperature loggers. Is this really necessary? And then now we're having a major marine heat wave. And so by doing that, it's been very rewarding to see like there are still fundamental things happening that we need to be able to study and understand. And so knowing that that data is still coming in, it's been rewarding to keep that going, realizing that there are things beyond COVID that we want to be able to keep a finger on the pulse of.
As we went through our critical research, water quality came right to the top. But now, we're seeing our ecosystem studies, those same long-term studies on ecosystem response and things like that. They're receiving a lot of attention, green lights. And so you're starting to see a lot of value placed on some of the science, which is nice to see. Right? So we'll move on to another question. And I think we'll start off possibly with Cora on this one. Is the long-term planning looking any different in the light of the situation?
For long-term planning, I think one place where our long-term planning has shifted is we're starting to look at new opportunities for programs, especially thinking about things like our education and outreach and mentorship and community engagement, because at first those shut down, and now we're thinking, you know, we need to completely reinvent our programs. There's a lot of discussion about things like field trips may never happen again. So what is the new reality of how we engage with people and how we share our research? And so that is starting to come up as a new set of strategies we need to work on. I think in terms of fundamental operations and research, so far we have not gotten to a place where we are expecting to change how we fundamentally do research or the focus of our research program.
I don't think we're going to fundamentally change the science that we're doing. I think what we will see change is how we manage our staff. In some regards, we've been more successful than maybe I thought we would have been working remotely. IT support has been great, and we really haven't missed a beat. But David brought this up. Collaborative science. How often is meeting face to face enough? And office space is expensive though. So if we can downsize our footprint over the long term, is there a benefit there? But how do we make sure that we're still interacting enough to keep that collaborative science going, to make sure that younger staff, newer staff are being trained, accordingly? I think there are a lot of those types of management questions that are going to come up over the long term. Personally,
And there's been no real discussion of this within our agency yet. We're still dealing with the now. But on a personal note, I'm going to be very interested to see, once this is behind us and the dust settles a little bit, what will those discussions look like about the future of office spaces and the future of teleworking, and how, if there are discussions that will come up, which I'm fairly confident there will be, about what does the new office space look like as a result of lessons learned from this. We fundamentally, our mission hasn't changed, our long-term planning hasn't changed, but there's some cracks beginning to form in that. You depend, as the longer this goes, you begin to see things through a slightly different lens. And I will say, for us, one benefit of this is that we've encouraged our staff to go back and say, listen, things are different than they used to be. What are some projects that have been sitting on your wish list to do, from last year, the year before, in some cases, multiple years, that people have had an interest in pursuing something that for one reason or another we weren't able to do, and that this may be a good time to dust those things off and take another look at them, whether they're, administrative things like old agreements, MOAs, MOUs, new research topics. It's across the spectrum, but that's an area that we've begun to look at and have put some effort on, or some emphasis on the staff level to take a look at those things and encourage them to explore that a little bit. So
some aspects of long-term planning that we're looking at are budget changes and constraints. We imagine that state budgets are going to potentially change, that local priorities and budgets are potentially going to change. And so we want to make sure that we figure out the best way that we can support those restoration and conservation goals that we have within the realities that our state and local partners are dealing with. And I think part of that we need to think about is better understanding and communicating how our priorities fit in with state and local priorities. So how those integrate together, and you can have co-benefits between different priorities. So I think those are going to be things that we'll be looking at in the long term.
Emily, you kind of led right into our next question a little bit, so we'll have you lead that off. Did resilience planning play a part of your organization's response? I think that's where you were sort of going when we're looking at meeting societal needs, a lot of different types of impacts that needs to be done at local planning levels, those types of things. So I was wondering where resilience planning came into some of your program's decision-making.
think in terms of our kind of immediate response to COVID, I'm not sure if I could say that resilience planning played a part into that response, especially with our partners. But I think it's something that we have recognized we want to pay a lot more attention to, especially around that aspect of our engagement with our partners. So I think each of our individual organizations likely rely on some of that resilience planning, whether it's to help us with our workplace changes or things like that. But in terms of moving forward, I think that aspect of how impacted our engagement with our partners was something that we, at least I hadn't really considered before. And so I think moving forward, that's definitely something we're gonna wanna have as part of the conversation, and how can those critical aspects of our role be more resilient to either things like COVID or other sorts of kind of big issues that come up in the future. So I think it's something that we're definitely going to want to plan into into what we do.
We focused a lot today on the mission side of it, but the human impact of this to our workforce has also been something that we haven't really talked much about. We've all gotten through the summer, but with school starting in about a week and a half or so, my wife is a school teacher, so she's going to be teaching. I got 3 kids that are going to be going back. It's a little overwhelming, not just even from the technology side. Oh my God, I got to have a router that's going to be handling 5 teleconferences going at the same time. I got to go out and buy computers and all the rest of that. But just from the, in the spring, it was, well, this is interesting. It's going to be a longer spring break, and then we're going to roll into an earlier summer, and that'll be fun. And but now, with the understanding that this is not going to be over come September 1st, this is a long-term thing. And I'm talking about myself, but my staff all have kids, and others have kids, and their husbands and wives and partners have other jobs. It's going to be it could be kind of a rough road going forward. And I think maybe talking about what each of us is doing with our staffs and our coworkers to mitigate that to the best extent possible might be something to talk about a little bit as well. At least be sensitive to it. I don't know to what extent an agency or a governmental entity has got the ability to influence that, but anyway, put that out.
That's a really great point. And I had an additional question that I've been throwing at folks to wrap up the conversation. And it's about self-care and what we're each doing to ensure that, we are resilient in our own operations, because everybody is continuing to show up for their constituents every day. And that takes a lot of energy, like you said, just given everything considered. So what is it that you are personally doing? We can go around quickly to maintain sane.
Don't think I'm maybe doing as much as I probably could. And some of that maybe comes down to a little sense of guilt. When I find my home situation getting a little bit stressful, there's the voices that says, well, why are you getting stressed out? You're around your kids, you're at home, you're getting a paycheck, you don't have COVID, you're still going to a restaurant occasionally, you're still going. I mean, this isn't like 1918 or what we saw in other countries where people were locked into their house, couldn't get out on the street. And so I struggle sometimes with like, why am I having anxiety and why is this stressing me out? And because maybe it shouldn't, maybe I'm overreacting a little bit to it. But then I find if I just go to the store by myself for 20 minutes, it's like, wow, this was kind of cathartic. It's quiet. And it is the realization that maybe I don't have as much time with my own thoughts and to strengthen, get prepared for the day, get prepared for work, get prepared for what I'm going to do, because you're immersed in this situation with everybody else, and we're all dealing with it. So to your question about what am I doing, probably not enough, but I'm aware that I probably need to be more forceful in creating some boundaries, not significant, but say, hey, I needed to go do something, whether it's going for a run, mowing the lawn, whatever, just so I've got a little time to sort of get my thoughts together and get ready for what's the next 24 hours or what have you.
One thing I keep reminding my staff is to try to separate their work life and their home life as much as possible. When you're working and living in the same room, it's difficult to do. It's so easy to pick up your computer at 10 o'clock at night and check your email. You know, why do you need to do that? So try to separate those things to the extent possible and maintain a home life and maintain a work life that aren't the same.
Part of that's also just taking time off. You know, we pre-COVID had a plan to go and spend a couple weeks traveling out west this summer for vacation. We didn't do that because there was no point. Everything was shut down, and so we decided not to do that. But the result of that is that we've now gone really without any time off. I have gone without any time off. Wife, even though she's a school teacher, has been involved, and she ended up teaching summer school. So we're about to roll into the fall semester, still with no time off, and my reluctance to quote waste leave when there's nothing to really do. But at some point, I'm going to probably have to do that, and it's probably healthy to do that, even if I'm not going anywhere. But again, to Mark's point, sometimes trying to separate those two things can be a little bit tough, but is certainly necessary, and I couldn't agree more. So
I think to keep myself sane, I'm very fortunate that I have the ability to get out and do outdoor activities pretty often. That's a big thing for me is being able to kind of get out and be outside, even if I'm away from people. So I go out and stand up paddleboard pretty frequently, or there's a lot of bike trails. This is actually a map in the background of the bike trails in DC that I like to hit up. So for me personally, that's really important. But to kind of piggyback on some of the other comments that have already been made, I do think that everyone has highs and lows. I have them too. I get fatigued. I get anxious. And I think that one of the things that I've really learned to try and do better during COVID, and that I hope we all take into the post-COVID world, is just being more kind and compassionate to each other, and understanding that we're all going through crazy things, and we all have those highs and lows, but then also being kind and compassionate to ourselves. I think that's something that I've really tried to work on is, don't get down on yourself just because you're having a low day. There might be something I really wanted to do for work and I just don't have the brain power to do it today, and that's okay. And I think kind of being understanding to ourselves that it's not going to last forever, and we'll get back out of that low and back up on a high. I think are things that I have tried to work on, and I hope that I take forward in the long term too.
There's been so much stress and anxiety and so many challenges to getting research going and to keeping it going. But one of the things we discovered immediately is as soon as we had enough safety plans and we had a plan moving forward and we had a schedule, getting into the field was so good for everyone. Every staff member, like getting on a boat when you've been in your house and you've been on Zoom for weeks, just to get out there and do what you're good at doing and be back in the open air. And it's been incredible. And for a lot of the people that came to do research with us, we were the first non-roommate that they had seen in like a month and a half, other than maybe someone at a gas station. And so there was this a humongous amount of gratitude that came along with getting people back into the field for the first time. So that's been really rewarding in terms of balancing the amount of stress and the number of challenges that have come with getting research going. So that I think has been really big. And things like time off. At our institution, for the safety of everyone, because we have a lot of people coming from outside of our community, one of the first things we did was implement a policy where you can't come to our institution or come into work if you have been traveling out of town or have been around more than 10 people, right? So taking a vacation suddenly is 2 weeks of working at home in addition to any time that you took off. And luckily, for better or worse, I, as the station director, was the first person who ended up in that situation. I had an ailing family member, but it was a good icebreaker to realize, like, okay, I need to abide by these policies, and actually everyone is fine. If you need to take a day and go see family or do something, and that means you can't come into work for 2 weeks, we will make it work. And so that actually having to go through that early was helpful in terms of making us realize, like, this is what's going to be going on for a long time, and we'll make it work because we have to.
There's a lot of operational programs out there and still doing things quietly and meeting their responsibilities and their agency's mission. I see things of, I think we heard around the table, you know, we have a strong research panel, but there was also reaching out to the education and training programs, you know, a recognition that they're an integral piece of what we do. And that we recognize those programs have been severely impacted but have adapted and continue to adapt. Another topic, I'm just trying to work off the top of my head, is we were hearing about technology, both from the high end and the low end. So from both ends to make it work. What's it take to make this happen? And so those are just a few of the takeaways. It sounds like we're still sort of mission focused. You know, no big changes, but there may be some. There are some opportunities out there, and I think everybody's looking at those as we do more shorter or longer term planning.
COVID has layered uncertainty on top of our base science, and it's nuanced, and I feel like a lot of that is because it's novel. But what is science and research if not novel? So I feel like you may be among those best poised to deal with a novel situation, and I really appreciate what you have continued to do on your teams and for the rest of us. And I appreciate you sitting in on this conversation and sharing your perspectives and experiences and giving of your time. So thank you. Thank you to our moderator and our panelists. Their bios, organizational info, and the resources they've mentioned will be found on our asynchronous platform, which is linked alongside these videos on the Chesapeake Bay near Virginia website. We invite you to join the conversation by posting your comments and sharing your experiences and resources with your colleagues in the coastal community. Do keep in mind that there are other panel recordings out there that will also be available on the website for you to check out. It's been a pleasure and an honor, and I hope you tune in to the next COVID on the Coast conversation.